Test, test, test. Mass testing of all suspected cases of COVID-19, then tracing their contacts and testing them, is accepted worldwide as the only successful method to fight COVID-19 and the pandemic. The only main countries that are ignoring WHO advice seem to be the UK and US, where the real science is being ignored. In this video, I'm going to explain the maths behind the only science that the actual COVID-19 virus is using. I'm not going to discuss the behaviour science nonsense, why it is nonsense and where it came from. That's for another video. All you need to be able to do for this video is to be able to multiply by 2 and divide by 3. I would normally use an exponential equation with base e, but this equation models the increase in cases fairly accurately. Here is the graph we get. Let's have a look at the numbers. The 100 at the front is the starting number of cases. I chose 100 so that we can see quite easily what's happening. The 2 simply means it's doubling, and days over 3 means it's going to double every 3 days. So in 3 days, 3 over 3 is 1, so it would double once. So we go from 100 to 200. After 6 days, it's 6 divided by 3, so that gives you 2, so it doubles twice. So it doubles twice, 200, then 400. Then after another 3 days, at 9 days, it doubles again to 800, then doubles again to 1600, then up to 3200, and then up to 6400. It keeps doubling. This is a terrifying graph. So how does this happen? I'll give you an example. Let's say, for example, Nicola Sturgeon gets COVID-19. She then hangs out with Jeane Freeman and Jason Leitch, and they now get COVID-19. That's the first doubling. We go from 1 to 2 cases. Now, say Jeane Freeman meets up with Catherine Calderwood and later goes to the Scottish Parliament and meets up with Humza Yousaf. And Jason Leitch goes on the 9 and shakes hands with the 2 presenters there. What we have now is doubling and then doubling again. We've got 1 case going to 4 cases. The actual number of persons each person affects in COVID-19 is actually slightly worse than that at 2.3. It's called the contagion. For seasonal flu, each person only infects just over 1 person, about 1.2, 1.3. This is why COVID-19 is so dangerous. This is really scary. Not very far up the graph, the NHS becomes overwhelmed. They run out of ventilators and senior citizens are left to die a horrible death. But there is another graph. This is the one that brings the number of cases back down again. This is the one, if we can get down into that region, we can let the old people back out again. We can visit, proper hand washing, keeping the general group size in society down, but that's where we want to be aiming for. Here is the equation for this graph. It's the same as the last one, but this time it's 0.5. We're halving each time rather than doubling. We're going from 6,400 down to 3,200 in the 3 days, and down to 1,600 in the 6 days. How does this work? This is why we need to test testing all suspected cases of COVID-19, then trace their contacts and test them. We'll go back to our example. If left to continue, our last 4 would then go on to infect 8 others. And then the 8 would go on to infect 16 others. Now we will introduce proper testing of all suspected cases of COVID-19, then tracing their contacts and testing them. Right, we're going to take 3 of our examples and we're now going to run the testing scenario. Jason suspects that he has COVID-19 and is tested immediately at the drive-in. His contacts are contacted, told to self-isolate and get tested immediately. His contacts include Rebecca and Martin. Although symptom-free, they are traced and told to go into isolation and are tested. Their contacts are traced, told to go into isolation, and apart from poor John, they're all clear. Instead of going from 2 to 4, they've gone from 2 to 1. And that is how this graph works. So it's halved at each point. This can only happen if you're locked down and you've got proper testing. Testing of the person and testing of the contacts. I'll repeat, this is why we need to test. Testing of all suspected cases of COVID-19, then tracing their contacts and testing them. Some viewers might say at this point, that's okay for a school or college lesson, but let's have a look at some real data from South Korea. So we'll have a look. You'll notice that the second half doesn't look too great. But we can do another equation that's very similar. The equation for this one is actually the new cases equals 6,400 times 0.67. What that means is that 3 cases goes down to 2 cases. It's not 2 to 1, but it's still very good at bringing the cases down. Now we'll take a look at joining the graphs up. But before that, I would like you to take a look at this graph. Do you see any sharp points in the graph apart from the points I got from Excel? There are none. When you have an exponential pandemic, there is only ever one good time to act, and that is now. When actions start to take effect, the graph comes off at a tangent and goes straight. The true flattening of the curve. The virus is still extremely dangerous, but it is now no longer exponential. I'm going to look at what happens when we act at 800 cases per day, 1,600 cases per day, and 3,200 cases per day. The area under the line gives the total number of infections. With 800 cases, we come off at a tangent at 800. We start lockdown and testing all suspected cases of COVID-19, then tracing their contacts and testing them. This beds in and we bend round to join the rescue graph. Now look at the area under the graph. You can see that there's quite a lot of cases, but not a huge amount. We can then look at what happens if we come off at a tangent at 1,600. So at 1,600, we come off the same. We start lockdown, testing all suspected cases, and we start to bend round. Now you can see that there's a huge difference in the number of cases under the graph. We're starting to run into a bit of a problem here. Now we'll try coming off 3 days later. So at 3 days later, we come off at the 3,200 and we can see that there's a bit of a problem at this size. We've got a huge number of cases. Now we'll have a wee look back. So that was only 3 days later. If we wait to lock down for 3 days, it's a huge difference. Another 3 days, and it's a far bigger difference. Now for a look at the time scale involved. South Korea, if you look at the dates at the bottom, managed to get things back under control within 3 weeks. Wuhan, the main outbreak in China, within 6 weeks. Now for a look at the size of the outbreaks. The outbreak in South Korea is around 10,000, which is just about 0.02% of their population. Not 60% as in flattening the curve. We are expected to endure 3,000 times the casualties because we won't test all suspected cases of COVID-19, then trace their contacts and test them. I'll repeat that. We're expected to take 3,000 times the casualty rate because we won't take World Health Organization advice. I didn't do graphs for flattening the curve because it's just too depressing. On this scale, the graph would go out the front of my house on the number of cases. And if we flatten the curve without testing, it would go out of my house to the right for many months. With flattening the curve, the virus is allowed to do what it wants. It's allowed to take 60% or more. They use variations of lockdown to try and keep contagion just over 1, like seasonal flu. That is what their flattening means. The virus will eventually start to run out of uninfected people to infect and will start to fall when about 50% are infected. This could keep the NHS from running out of ventilators and having to let people die as is happening in Italy. But probably it won't work due to the length of time people have to stay on a ventilator to recover. Deaths would be just about as high, just over a longer period. There are other complicated and interesting issues to discuss, like what to do when we get the graph back near the bottom, but I want to keep this video short. In summary, there is only one basic science and the virus is in control. This doesn't mean it has to be like Dunkirk. The virus does not need to be winning. If we get organised so we test all suspected cases of COVID-19, then trace their contacts and test them. This should be more like D-Day. We get our NHS troops and others properly kitted out. We send them into battle knowing that this is no rearguard action. We are not retreating to the beaches. We are going to win this. I hope that with this little bit of information gleaned here, you will feel confident enough to have a look through the scientific documents on the pandemic. Also, when somebody says scientists said, I hope you have the confidence to ask which scientists and for a copy of their data. Please read The Emperor's New Clothes to your children and explain the similarities to what happened here. This must never happen to another generation. The next time it could be our children in danger of slaughter. A wee note for Scotland only. Committees are no good. We have our own local expert, Devi Sridhar. Put Devi completely in charge. No fixed budget, everybody answers to her. She will save us I can already see her statue in George's Square. It might not be Freedom Square, it might be Sridhar Square, not far down from Nelson Mandela's statue.